E3 1995, a place where many brands would gather to promote their newest craft to the public, with highly eye-catching marketing, trailers and whatnot. Everyone was eagerly anticipating the continuation of the warfare between Nintendo and Sega from the 4th generation. But unbeknownst to most people, a third contender would rise from seemingly out of nowhere. The PlayStation was Sony's pet project, and the result of a bitter grudge against the two titans for both rejecting a collaboration for a game console. With Nintendo, the end result would be this.
You know what they say, all toasters toast toast.
But Sega being the most recent rejection at the time, Sony would make damn sure to not only surpass them, but utterly crush them. During the Sega conference, they would reveal the Saturn to the public, but whatever the guy talking about it had to say is irrelevant. You don't give a shit, trust me. Nobody back then did either, because only one thing stuck shortly afterwards.
$2.99.
This moment right here, that's all it took to change the gaming landscape forever as we knew it. By humiliating one of its potentially biggest competitors, a single price tag is all it took to put the PlayStation in the game. It's fair to say that the Sony we have nowadays is a different beast entirely compared to what it used to be, and not particularly for the better. One of its biggest memes is how the PlayStation 5 has no games, a tune sang by its predecessor, the PlayStation 3. Unlike the PS Triple, the collection it currently has isn't anywhere as interesting as previous generations. Did it also need another port of The Last of Us? All of this, however, doesn't originate from hatred towards the brand, but frustration, because back in the late 90s and early 2000s, the PlayStation set the bar so high in the first place. Many iconic games and series were made hugely successful through the PlayStation 1, such as Metal Gear Solid,
¿Pero qué coño?
Castlevania,
Time, monster! You don't belong in this world!
I would really prefer if you would be quiet.
Crash Bandicoot,
My cock is much bigger yours.
Final Fantasy VII,
¿Podrías darle un saludo a mi primo Manolo? Saludo, Manolo. Gracias.
and many other examples. But one particular franchise always stuck out to me the most, as it clicked a lot of the right notes to make for a great experience. But despite having been present on nearly every Sony device, it's not as widely remembered as most of the franchises that made it big under the PlayStation, first party or otherwise. This is WipEout.
A race is hard for last in my life. This is awesome. Nothing you did there helped. Just go ahead, do what you guys want. I'm sure you got computers in there to tell you what to do. Glad we're making all the highlight reels now.
WipEout was the golden goose of British dev team Psygnosis, later known as Studio Liverpool. Their beginnings were marked by mostly forgettable old-school shovelware, like the majority of studios at the time. That is until their smash hit title, Lemmings. Bet you didn't see that one coming. Yeah, like any British out there, when they quit their balcony instincts and get deep in their craft, shit gets done, alright. But afterwards they wanted to experiment a little further. The idea behind WipEout was simple. What if we fuse Mario Kart and F-Zero, but make it 3D and more grounded to reality? As in, it resembles Formula 1, but in the future of 2052. Couple this with a soundtrack that featured techno and drum and bass, and you got a recipe for a successful series. Although it certainly wasn't a fresh start when your advertising consists of a bloody mess.
Cocaína.
But hey, they got off to a head start regardless. They managed to be one of the PS1's launch titles. In Europe anyway. This series would go on to spawn a small following, and during its golden age, held its ground against major titans. It was never a series destined to upstage Metal Gear Solid or Final Fantasy VII, but it made enough impact to not fall into irrelevancy. That being said, there may be a question lingering in some people's minds. Wasn't WipEout some TV show from like a decade ago? In a very unfortunate twist of fate for a British intellectual property, another brand new American intellectual property was right around the corner in 2008. They just so happened to have the same name as WipEout. If you Google WipEout without specifying anything else, chances are you're always gonna get results for the TV show first and the game second. Now don't get me wrong, I used to watch this TV show. It was great for a couple laughs at other people's skill issues. It's just the bitter irony that we live in a world where two WipEouts exist, It also makes it more difficult to look up information about the games, since results of the TV show are also more likely to show up. But that didn't detract those that were interested in anti-gravity racing antics, and those that would go out of their way to play it would find out... Well, that one's rather subjective, ain't it? I can tell you though, it was my fucking shit. As is the case with the majority of video games and occasionally other media, the first WipEout is rough around the edges. Graphically speaking, it's gonna be the natural weakest entry in the series, even though with enough stylization, older titles can look better than newer ones. That's where the Designers Republic comes in. They were the ones to breathe life and soul into the series, with its mixture of odd futuristic shapes inspired by Japanese culture and pretentious slogans. It's a fusion of minimalism and overabundance that's distinctly unique to Designers Republic and has become synonymous with old school WipEout. And during their first outing, they do a good job with what they were given, but in places it feels like a rough draft. I mean, I love these stupidly over-designed loading screens, but it looks like random assets and trivia were thrown into the mix. The graphics were bound to age like milk regardless, but as long as it plays well, so what if it looks outdated, right? Unfortunately, gameplay is also another department where WipEout 1 falls short. They didn't quite nail the physics, so while it can get exhilarating at times, the majority of the experience can be a struggle, as the ships constantly bounce during uphills and downhills. Cornering with air brakes feels good for the most part, but it slows your craft a significant amount. It's still required to do so if you don't want to fully slow down. Wall collisions are absolute buzzkills. The smallest touch can halter your craft and jeopardize the run, so you must maneuver as carefully as possible and minimize mistakes. Then there's the matter of the weapons. Taking cues from Super Mario Kart as mentioned earlier, the WipEout series is known for the usage of weapons, although there's a more integral strategy element. Well, not so much in the first game. Obviously, using a turbo on the wrong spot will send you straight into a wall, but otherwise they're all pretty disposable. And for the time being, all of the opposing attacks can do is slow you down. There's two speed classes, in the form of Venom and Rapier, former being the slow one and latter the fast one. The difference is felt after playing each one, and there's even a neat daytime change. Otherwise, it feels a bit empty just having two speed classes, at least considering the hindsight of the series usually featuring up to 4. And last we have the ships themselves, and at first glance it gives the impression they're just palette swaps. And it might be, as far as I know. I did a bit of research in order to find anything regarding stats with each craft, and found... nothing. I guess pick whichever you want is the main mentality. I'm going with Daniel Chang. I'm sure nothing will go wrong rolling with this guy. The ships themselves may not have any apparent differences at first glance. But did you know they actually have background lore? No really, get a load of this. Originally European, but later bought out by Japan, AG Systems was the very first anti-gravity company founded in 2017. Its founder, Pierre Belmondo, has always valued higher experimentation for the good of mankind, rather than for racing. However, said experimentation wouldn't grant the team as many wins as they wanted, and in an ironic twist of fate, they would accidentally lay the grounds for the 3 teams that would give them competition. Feisar, also known as... that, has become over the years the one team synonymous with WipEout, as the most recognizable with its iconic ships and 2006 Formula 1 Renault colors. So how do they perform? Like fucking shit. After realizing that Japan bought out AG Systems, Europe would go out of their way to create their own team with blackjack and hookers. However, unlike Japan, Europe was an entire continent full of separate countries, with their own goals and intentions, meaning everyone wanted their cake and eat it too. Feisar's ship development was nothing short of a nightmare, earning them multiple losses in races. But that didn't stop them from gathering fans and racers alike. Auricom and Kyrex are like two siblings yelling at each other. In fact, that's how their founders, Delia Flaubert and host Lightning McQueen, got fired from AG Systems. The former for being too defensive of Belmondo's ideals, and the latter criticizing how much money the company was missing out on. Each one went on their separate ways. Auricom, much like AG Systems, became overly centered on the race for the good of mankind mentality, like the true patriot it has become. Kyrex, on the other hand, did everything for the money, while is creating the most effective crafts seen up to this point. They would go on to win the F3600 League. Now you may have heard all of this and thought to yourself, wait, what the fuck? Does any of that appear in the game? To which the answer is an absolute no. All of this info could only be found on manuals and other obscure sources. I don't know, I just used Wiki myself. Before moving on, it is impossible to talk about WipEout and not bring up the soundtrack. The first game was entirely carried by one-man Team Wright, aka Cold Storage. His style during WipEout 1 could be described as a mix of trance, techno and house. It's rather upbeat, managing to feel alien yet inviting at the same time. It's a cold soundtrack for lack of a better word, well worth giving a listen. The first WipEout is a little difficult to get into. Playing it for this video has been enjoyable, but it's not something I tend to hop into when I want to chill out for a bit. It's also very lacking in terms of things to do and in presentation. The pieces are there, but it needed some extra time in the oven. I may play its soundtrack on the occasion though. That still holds up to this day. And above all else, one can confidently say this game was nothing short of passionate and with determination to improve. WipEout 2097 is where we start getting more apparent regional differences. For some reason the game was localized in America as WipEout XL. Other than that, it's the same game that suffers the classic regional box art differences. The gameplay formula has remained the same since WipEout 1, but mechanically it's a different beast entirely. New speed classes have been added alongside Venom and Rapier. Vector class, which I can only describe as a children's attraction, and the complete opposite in Phantom class, the most notorious speed class in the series, featuring 5 laps that will test skill and endurance. Instead of being based off of 2 separate tournaments, now you need to get a gold medal on each track individually, then clear the upcoming Challenge 1, which is all the tracks available on Rapier back to back. After clearing it, 2 new tracks in Bostock Island and Spilskinanka are made available, and have to be cleared to unlock Challenge 2. This challenge will either make you rage quit or get real good at the game, for you have to finish first in all of the 8 tracks consecutively, so don't let that skill issue of yours take over. Oh, did I mention it's all done in Phantom class? Beating Challenge 2 essentially wins you the game, as the final unlockable is made available to you, and I'll talk about it afterwards, just to be a cunt. Above all else, the game's physics are the most noteworthy change so far. They finally managed to get a grip on how to make the ships feel satisfying. They're a lot less bouncy and respond better to cornering. Your ship will still come to a halt if you make contact with a wall, but scraping it should be much safer than before. It's because of these physics, in fact, that WipEout 2097 is regarded as the best entry in the series, and everything else, while still high quality, didn't reach the same heights. Is that a take I agree with? We'll see. But hey, another contributing factor is the brand new soundtrack. Cold Storage delivers again with new songs, but far more guest artists have joined in, such as the Chemical Brothers and the Future Sound of London. It's a much more explosive and adrenaline-inducing variety. Among other changes, we see the addition of the timer, which only serves to add pressure to lesser skilled people. But once you know the ins and outs of the racetracks, it's really there as decoration, and I guess to stroke your ego a little bit. Much more impactful than that would be the introduction of the health meter, and this one is here to stay. As means of making the series closer to Formula 1, they gave every ship in the racetrack a set durability, worn out by wall collisions and weapons this time around. And it goes without saying that if it gets depleted, get off the racetrack, sweetheart. All of the weapons come back, and some with extras, such as 3 rockets over just 1. But the new additions stole the spotlight. While not a weapon, the autopilot is your best friend for the trickiest corners, although it can be a bit inconvenient when it runs out and you're about to slam into a corner. I also don't like the slightest damage means it gets you a free trial through the pit lane. More popular than the autopilot would possibly be the Quake, and this was not its best outing. Don't get me wrong, it's a fun weapon, I mean just look at it. But having it blind you from the track ahead in Phantom class is a pain in the dick. Also shoutouts to backwards firing missiles. What a base-breaking piece of shit addition. All the ships from WipEout 1 make a return in spectacular fashion, featuring much more unique models, and the beginning of Feisar's unofficial series mascot position. I mean look at it, it's a great design. They also got rid of the character select thing, so say goodbye to such memorable people like Kel Solar and Nastasha Cherobosky. Who cares? Most important, we now can read the stats for each ship. Feisar controls fine, but I hope you like staying behind the pack for most of the race. AG Systems has all around good stats, but lasts as long as Stray's uniqueness factor. Auricom, like the average American, doesn't excel at anything in particular. It's just there, and for unknown reasons I kinda hate it. The Kyrax, on the other hand, is the best ship in the game. Its handling is the most crippling weakness, but it also serves as its strength, as you struggle the most to tame the steel beast. And once you do, there's no better feeling, clocking in the fastest laps and achieving first place earlier than the rest. And then you have the new kid in town. Piranha is a newcomer on the F5000 League, and notable first impression is an understatement. Gameplay wise, look at those fucking stats! This thing is fast and agile, almost uncontrollable at times. A true speed demon on all accounts, but can't use weapons, so... lore wise, it's just as absurd. It's a fusion between two separate Brazilian companies, Pier and... Hana. Eventually, a Chinese consortium purchases Piranha, and all they do for several years is parts manufacturing, all to distract everyone from the real project, the P666 prototype. The craft itself could only be described as perfection, but finding a pilot to match its potential was difficult, and the few recruited would still struggle to handle the vehicle. The end result? Kyrax would go on to win the F5000 League. And did you know that Spilskinanka isn't some random Russian word, but an anagram for Snake Plissken? I thought that was interesting. Before we move on to WipEout 3, I think it's fair to do a little detour to the oddity in the family known as WipEout 64. Full honesty here, this was my first ever WipEout, and it might be for the most absurd, stupid reason imaginable. Remember when I brought up the TV show earlier? Well, I happened to be a fan of it when I was about 11 years old or so, and I wanted to see if there were any free games. So in my infinite wisdom, I look up Nintendo 64 games and find this game called WipEout 64. I think you can imagine what would happen next. At the time, my disappointment was immeasurable and my day was ruined. But strangely, I kept coming back to it. I was getting my ass kicked by it, but somehow felt compelled to keep going. Eventually I left the game after growing bored. Years later I picked it back up again, with the added knowledge and experience from other entries. It wears the skin of 2097 and manages to have unique licensed tracks, which is impressive for the system it's on, but the feel of the game is a different beast entirely. Progression is done through a series of missions with certain specifics. They also feature time attacks and, debuting here, elimination missions. Yeah, they took the addition of health and pushed it further with a much more aggressive emphasis, like having a kill count on the right side. But what sets WipEout 64 apart is, once again, the physics. Steering is incredibly sharp and there's a heavy focus on maintaining constant speed, even though some corners may still be tricky enough to issue significant slowdown. The Piranha ship returns as an unblockable, but this ain't your grandma's Piranha. The Model 2 has been allowed to use weapons, like the cheating bastard it is. If you were miffed about not being able to use them in 2097, well, here's your fix. 64 is a fine enough entry, largely forgotten due to its console's reputation with PS1 ports or alternative versions. Besides, WipEout's fanbase was much more established in that very console. It was gonna be difficult to sell people into the series with a very similar one on the same library. So let's get the fuck back to the PS1. Cards on the table, WipEout 3 is my favorite of the series. For the longest time I've been considering whether it, 2097 or HD was my personal favorite. And 3 won out in the end, thanks to its balance between content and gameplay. The first thing anyone will notice is the hardcore change in aesthetic. Still under the wing of Designers Republic, rather than going for evolving the tried and true, they took a heavy turn towards a stylish yet minimalistic aesthetic. A fit for the big event of the year, the turn of the millennium. And this extends to the graphics. Psygnosis gave it their A-game and everything has been redesigned with this slick minimalism in mind. An art style that has managed to remain timeless. And the music still kicks ass as usual. Instead of cold storage, DJ Sasha was put in charge of the majority of the songs. I like how they titled after some of the themes, implying those are the actual themes. God, I can't wait to play as Expander. Physics are a bit more slippery than before, and the ships have bigger hitboxes, making it more likely for a wall collision. But hey, more chances to land a hit with a weapon too. It's usually this reason some prefer 2097. But I personally don't mind the added struggle. It can make for more intense cornering in places like Manor Top. One big change that only made its appearance in WipEout 3 is the Hyper Thrust. Instead of a turbo item, you can gradually increase your speed by trading the ship's health. It's the ultimate risk-reward. Cut your life down to cut some seconds off.
That was clean.
Stat-wise, the ships remain mostly the same.
Who the fuck are you?
Yeah, we also have newcomers, go figure. I'll get to them later, but returnees are about the same, except Piranha, which is now a regular team instead of a super hard unlock with godly status. One thing about the ships, they feel a lot more frail than before. It's much more likely you'll have to go for a pit stop if you fuck up too much. For new weapons, we have the likes of the Cloak, which just turns you invisible to the opposition. Useful to avoid being targeted, worthless elsewhere. And then its annoying brother, the Reflector. It essentially sends back any incoming missiles and rockets, the same way Return to Sender transfers debuffs from Squirrely to the player. There it is! There's the shitty tie-in to my regular content to keep my core audience invested in the video! In terms of the lore that remains unexplained in the games, unlike the previous games that held races within several real-life countries, this time we have the much less interesting Mega City. These always bother me for some reason. I guess it's the generic name and not having it tied to real location, it just becomes a lot less interesting. Minor nitpick I know, but hey, that's what headcanons are for. Additionally, we have 3 newcomers this time around. Starting off with Goteki 45, and they might be the most interesting. They originate from a fictional island known as Makana, located in the Pacific. At least this one is less ambiguous. What's not so ambiguous is their violent tendencies on the racetrack. Instead of competing like a Gran Turismo player, they would often compete like a burnout enjoyer, trying to rack up as many eliminations as possible. This was thought to be an attempt to undermine the league's reputation, and a disgruntled anonymous source decided to mail them a present. Ever since, nobody knew who destroyed Goteki 45's headquarters. It had to be Auricom with their race purity bullshit. Ascent is Africa's representative, following an invitation by the league's administration, thanks to the success of African pilots in the past, and to achieve actual international representation. Except the Australians, they can wait their sorry cunts until 2005. Thanks to their ship's remarkable agility, they would go out of the way to make a notable placement on their first league. And that's about it, really. It's not that remarkable lore-wise. Though it is funny that Piranha bought Ascent for the next league, just because they were salty as fuck their craft wasn't as agile. Last there's Icaras, and this has to be my favorite for one reason I'm not gonna spoil just yet. It started as an indie project by some entrepreneur, Bernstein Burns, funded solely through independent investors, and developed in about 7 months, allegedly. Icaras was formed with one goal in mind, to bring AG racing into a new age. To do so, they made a fast-as-shit craft, capable of outrunning anything and in cases passed them a second time. In theory anyway. The craft is fast for sure, but it was dog shit elsewhere. Thrust was barely existent, so losing speed was severely punished. Handling was on the average end, but not enough for the absurd speeds the Icaras achieved. And the less we talk about the shields the better. It managed to do the unthinkable, make Feisar look good in comparison. So eventually they retired the team, and Burns suffered a tragic death in a balloon accident by choking with one at a kid's party. And so it all comes down to this. All the teams have their own motivations and drives set up, their racing crafts ready for one final balls to the walls race for the F7200 championship. But the question remains, who will come out on top on this arduous challenge? Will Feisar finally break its losing streak and prove that Europe has something of actual worth? Will AG Systems, with its dogshit shields, be able to finish the race well ahead on the entire pack? Is Auricom's drive to keep Belmondo's vision sufficient to overcome their competitors? Or is the overpowered Kyrex still too much of a heavy obstacle for them and everyone else? Can Piranha still maintain their status after the craft downgrade and come to Brazil winning? Can Goteki not get disqualified because of foul play? Will Asagai's handling supremacy take over the league? And will Icaras not rage quit? All these questions will be answered. Of course fucking Kyrex wins. What the fuck did you think I was setting up those winning bits for? Outside of the main campaign and time trials, other game modes include challenges, which pits you against trials similar to those in WipEout 64, as well as tournament, stacking a bunch of tracks in one setting. It's mostly filler and it doesn't really reward you with anything. But tournament at least I appreciate, for the sake of streamlining replayability. And then there's the prototypes. Unlocking these requires you to earn a gold medal on each circuit with each craft in a single speed class. Doing it on Phantom unlocks 3 prototypes at once, much appreciated for the sake of moving shit along. The aesthetic takes cues from how virtual reality was envisioned at the time, but it sure doesn't help for cornering. The prototypes can get brutal at times, and finishing a perfect lap is nothing short of a miracle. If nothing else, it adds some extras like replay value, but that's really it. One last thing that's very worth bringing up. In 2000, Psygnosis began the trend of giving Europe the long end of the stick, with WipEout 3 Special Edition. Finally, something truly worthwhile to come out of this territory. If you seek any version of WipEout 3, make it this one since it contains all the original content plus some extras. Well, one extra working as the end-all be-all, the classic lead. Think retro curses from Mario Kart and you get the same result here. The tracks remain about the same structure-wise, although WipEout 1 circuits had to be modified to fit a pit lane somewhere, and because the difference in physics is so vast, they can still feel different enough for better or for worse. Nonetheless, it's still very worth engaging. Putting it all together, and WipEout 3 makes a strong contender for one of the games I've replayed the most, thanks to its abundance in features, solid gameplay, clean visuals, and stellar soundtrack. And outside of what my thoughts may be, it's undeniable the quality of the game is impressive and praiseworthy. So with the quality consistency Psygnosis was capable of producing, how come WipEout's run folded? Among many reasons, it was never all that mainstream. After WipEout 3, the series would ride a slow descent into obscurity. It didn't have it as bad as F-Zero, but the lack of interest in the franchise was beginning to grow. It began with WipEout Fusion, often deemed as the black sheep of the franchise. Truth be told, I was just not engaged by it. I gave it a fair shot, but it feels really off in gameplay terms, and the aesthetic is unfortunately much weaker following the departure of Designers Republic. The game being a weak entry is one thing, being released during the 2000-2003 period is another. It stood its ground during the late 90s, but it was a Hail Mary by this point. During the PSP years, fortunes changed for a while, with the release of WipEout Pure Impulse. These heavily revamped the gameplay yet again, but taking a step back to what once worked. They were well received, but the PSP itself was a fairly niche console, and competing with the DS during its strongest years was a tall order. Still highly regarded and fun to play, Pulse was my reintroduction to the series, and convinced me to give the other entries a shot as well. WipEout HD is a strong contender for the best title in the series, top 3 at the very worst. Although it's unfortunate it ended up as a literal HD version of some of the tracks from Pure and Pulse. Still, it's the most accessible in the form of the Omega Collection. And also I got the Platinum on that son of a bitch. Last we have 2048, working as a prequel to the whole series. Unfortunately, I don't have a PS Vita to play the game, but from what I've read, it's also a well-regarded entry, making it almost worth getting the console for it, alongside Project Diva. That takes us to current day, following the shutdown of Studio Liverpool, formerly known as Psygnosis. The most recent title is just a collection of both HD and 2048 on PlayStation 4, developed by XDev. Okay, let's see what I can say about it. Oh fuck, they made the Buzz games? Remember when that was a thing? As well as SingStar and all that first-party shovelware? Later on, there was a mediocre mobile game that not even supporters care about.
I could go for a good forever sleep right about now.
Pretty dire situation to be a WipEout fan, as nowadays most of the focus seems to be put on more cinematic and story-driven experiences, not so much arcade races from years ago. But to be honest, it may be for the best that WipEout is not around anymore. At least it had a peaceful enough departure. That being said, not all is bad news. Ballistic NG is a fan-made AG racing game, taking heavy inspiration from all the WipEout games, but its biggest attractive would have to be its Steam Workshop compatibility, a haven of mods for the game. Go check it out if you find it any interesting, be it for the modding scene or some old-fashioned AG racing. So what can we take away from this video? That old school arcade racers are cool as shit. This is a series I was always passionate about, thanks to its challenging yet smooth gameplay, and the stupidly long lore that just goes unexplained in the games. Okay, maybe that not so much, but still. It's not a series that attracts many people. Hell, most of them still mistake it for the TV show, but it's something that can click for the right person. That said, thanks for watching, and hopefully I work on something my audience may give a shit about next time. For now, I'll just go get a Red Bull. For some reason I must purchase like 27 cans. I don't know why. Piece of shit is fucking possible to open one-handed.
Oiga the boss! Radio 5 motori